I kind of coined this on Twitter as white woman immortality, and they're all gay for each other. Time is silly, and I am the silliest little goose. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Gia. I am a 26-year-old lady who lives in my mom's basement, and today is the July wrap-up. I read 6 books in the month of July. 2 of them were audiobooks, 3 of them were ebooks, and 1 of them was a physical copy. I read just over 1,600 pages and just about 51 and a half hours of audiobooks, which sounds skewed, but that's because we had a couple of DNFs. I had 3 DNFs this month. 2 of them were audiobooks, so they do contribute to my pages and minutes for the month, but I didn't complete them. I will do another video separately because I had an abnormal amount of DNFs in the month of July, again 3 of them, so I will be talking about that at a later time. My reading graph stayed pretty consistent. There were days where I would read a chunk and then a couple of days where my reading would go down, where I would only read a little bit every day, but I am still on a streak with the story graph. I think I'm at like a 90-day streak I just hit the other day. The first book that I read in July was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I rated this 4 stars and I listened to it on audiobook. I really enjoyed this story. I did have a few little issues here and there, but I tried to absorb the book as it was and how it was delivered to me, and tried not to, find too many issues with something that didn't need to be there. But I couldn't help but have a couple of things to say. I'm not going to explain this plot in detail because most people have read this book already. It's very popular on BookTube, Book Talk, and Book Twitter. But for the uninitiated, the chronically offline, or those living under a rock, this is about a woman named Adeline LaRue, or Addie LaRue. She was born in, I believe, 1744, and she makes a plea to a god who would listen, that she doesn't want to be married to somebody. She wants to be a woman who goes through life on her own terms, and the God that she pleads to interprets this as she wishes to be invisible but also immortal. So he grants her a form of immortality where she can go through life immortal, but nobody will ever remember her. It will be as though she's a living ghost and that nobody will ever know who she is. So a big part of this book is about Addie being a anonymous person that makes their mark on history through inspiring artists to create art about them, and about the whole idea of when you're creating art about something that has a muse or a model, if they're unnamed, they're just a woman or just a person or a figure. And Addie tries to become that person that inspires a work of art that then can be looked at for decades, even if she is unnamed. It is a way for her to be documented. The things that I took issue with is that Addie is a 300-year-old woman who has lived through 300 years of history, and not once did we get a lot of comment on history that she existed in. I understand at a certain point she became numb to what was going on around her because it's not like she could make an impact on it regardless. So because nobody would remember her the next day, all she did was steal things to get by, and she would stay in vacant apartments that were owned by actors that spent 6 months filming in Australia so that she could just live in their homes as a squatter and no one would ever know that she was there. That kind of a thing. She just went through life invisible. Nobody ever knew who she was. And I understand how at a certain point you can become numb to things going on around you, because quite literally it does not affect you, and anything you do will not have any effect on it. So Addie herself is very apathetic. She doesn't really have a lot of concern for anything other than herself because she doesn't have to. However, I kind of coined this on Twitter as white woman immortality. There was a scene in the book, which I don't remember exactly which scene it was supposed to be portraying, but it was one of France's many revolutionaries, major and minor, and Addie herself comments on the fact that she is passing a group of soldiers or revolutionaries, and she says, Vive la France, and keeps walking, and they stop her and talk to her, but she doesn't make any moves to be involved in anything or to have any particular stance on anything. This woman, like living in the United States, has lived through the historical context, the real historical context of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and the Civil Rights era, and never, not once, did we get any comments on. You see where I'm going with this? I would have nothing to say about this if at some point Addie said something about what was going on around her at the time and how she felt about it. I will say, though, that this book does include some really nice and refreshing, good LGBTQ representation, and I really, really, really liked that. A lot of the side characters were queer, and I really appreciated that inclusion, and Addie didn't have anything off to say about it. Such a statement is not necessary given the context of the story and given the direction of the story. It's just, I found something a little off-putting in the back of my head about the idea of a woman, a white woman, living through 300 years of history and never, not once, saying something about slavery, about racism. I wanted her to say something. And this is not a very uncommon criticism to have. There are people on Goodreads who have said that, this is basically just a white woman existing through history, but in a form where no one can remember her the next day. And I can understand where that frustration comes from, which is why I'm bringing it up. An amazing experience. I genuinely enjoyed my time with this book. The next book that I read was Empress of All Seasons by Emiko Jean. I finally got around to reading this book, and I really, really, really enjoyed it. I also rated it 4 stars. This story combines fantasy and Japanese mythology to create a world in which humans and yokai live side by side. Yokai being a Japanese mythological creature that can take many forms, that can do many things. They are considered a kind of shapeshifter of some kind. There's multiple forms of yokai, multiple things that they can do. They're almost like a classification of a mythical creature that can encompass multiple things. Like our main character, Mari, who is a yokai that is classified as an animal wife. So all animal wives are yokai, but not all yokai are animal wives. An animal wife is a yokai that takes the form of a very beautiful woman who get by in society by enchanting men into marrying them and then usually killing them before taking their money and running and bringing it back to their community. This is how they have like a self-sufficient society where they have these isolated little communities where the young animal wives go out to find a husband and then they come back with all of this money. And most of the time, their aim is to come back with money and being with child. But the thing is, trigger warning, the child has to be a girl in order to stay in this world. If the child is a boy, it is sent down the river and sometimes are picked up by monks, but sometimes they are not. Mari is seen as kind of an ugly duckling where the other animal wives low-key bully her and don't believe that she will be successful. And in order to be a true animal wife and be on your own, you have to be successful. Like, you have to go out and find your first husband so then you can go out and find the second and the third. So Mari and her mother believe that her future lies in conquering the seasonal palace rooms, which is a kind of a competition of sorts where girls from all over the kingdom will come and compete in these challenges that include conquering rooms or arenas, kind of their seasonal arenas based on the seasons. And there are beasts, there are traps, there are things that they have to do in order to get through these rooms, and the girl that ends up the winner ends up the empress, and that is how the prince marries. It's kind of an opposite. Instead of the men competing for the hand of a woman, it's the opposite. It is women competing for the hand of a man. So Mari enters this competition and she slays it. She absolutely slays it. But what I found really interesting about this book is the way that it is composed, is that it felt very rushed, and it felt like we weren't spending a lot of time with the characters and what was going on. Like, there was a little bit of a revolution going on in the background, and there was a little bit going on with some love interests, but everything felt very fast-paced, and I was kind of like, what is going on? Like, this is almost a 400-page book. Why do I feel like it's rushing? Well, we were also getting these interludes of like mythological entries in a book where the different deities that they worship were interluding into the story that we are reading, with a progression of a myth starting at the very beginning with the first bit of the myth, and then we get a chunk of the story with Mari, and then we get the next step in the mythology. So you're getting this kind of like 2-story system going where you're being told Mari's story, but then also this mythological story. So in the end, Mari not only becomes the Empress of All Seasons, but she also becomes a like a part of the mythos, which I found to be very interesting because then at the end you kind of look back on the story and reflect and see that it is more of seeing a mythology being written in real time. It's almost like the experience of a living legend or like something being written. It's like if you were to be the best friend of Hercules as he goes through his life and then you hear about all of his adventures and maybe or maybe not you're writing it down for him or somebody is, and that reflection that you're writing plus your experiences are what create the initial mythos of where it came from. And I thought that this was a very interesting concept because, you know, so many mythologies are constructed in a way that it's been multiple versions down the line, that the story is what it is now, but it might not be even remotely similar to the original story. It might have certain elements that remain consistent, but it might not be reflective of the original story. This would be the story that then gets turned into other stories that we then find, you know, thousands of years down the line that we read in a book, and it's kind of deconstructed and simplified. This was the more like real story of the mythology. And I found that to be extremely compelling. It was very well constructed. I will warn you, there is bloodshed, there is death. I mean, there are girls competing to the death to become the empress. Of course, there's death. But it doesn't sugarcoat things, and there are a lot of twists that you will not see coming. And in hindsight, I may have to increase my rating because now that I'm talking about it and reflecting on it a full month later, I think it should be rated higher than 4 stars. The next book that I read was The Atlas Paradox by Olivia Blake. I know I still need to do my deep dive video on Olivia Blake because I've been a fan of hers for many, many years, but I have only ever read of her original publications. I've only read The Atlas 6 and The Atlas Paradox. Now her fan fiction, I've read a lot of her fan fiction, but that's besides the point. I've had a lot going on lately. So I really struggled to connect to Olivia's writing at this time in my life. So I decided to switch to audiobook. I've been absorbing audiobooks at a much better and faster rate than I have been traditional books or ebooks lately. So I was like, you know what? Her writing is very dense. Although I love it, it is very dense, and I know this. So why don't I move over to an audiobook format because I might absorb it better, and maybe I could even re-listen to the Atlas 6 on audio, and I might have a better appreciation of her book because I did rate the Atlas 6 5 stars, don't forget. So like if I wanted to go back and listen to it on audio, I would be able to revisit something that I loved from a different perspective. So I listened to it on audio, and it was great. I rated it 4.5 stars. I didn't love it as much as the Atlas 6. Having different voice actors for all of the characters was very interesting, and it actually allowed me to attach voices to the personalities because this is a multi-perspective story with, you know, 6 people. It's very hard to find their narrative voice. They all have this pretentiousness about them with a degree of aloofness and sarcasm and, you know, quippy personality, but they all kind of go back and forth with the very, very, again, pretentious dialogue that makes them all sound kind of similar, but being able to attach voices to them definitely helped. Like, definitely helped. Like, if you struggled to read this, listen to it on audio because I'm telling you, it is a changed experience. So we are picking up where we left off in the Atlas 6, where Libby has gone missing, and we were supposed to be led to believe that she is dead, but she is not. So we do get Libby's perspective a good bit in this book, actually, which I was thankful for. I was a little bit worried when I picked up the book that the girl that went missing was not going to be featured much at all, except in name only, but she actually is featured in perspective a lot, and I really, really enjoyed that. So we are picking up where we last left off with trying to find out where Libby is, but then also the other 5 that are still in the Alexandrian Society are fighting. The girls are fighting because in the Atlas 6, when they found out that 6 of them were chosen, but only 5 of them could ascend and 1 of them had to die, there was a lot of drama over who were they going to choose to die and why. And now that they all know who they would have chosen, the girls are fighting. The girls are picking sides. The girls are fighting. They all have their own agendas. They're all trying to figure out where Libby is. And then they're also trying to figure out, what is Atlas Blakely up to? Because, you know, he brings them into the Alexandrian society and he's the reason that they're there in the first place. But then by the end of the first book, we're led to believe that the caretaker is not as good of a guy as we think he is. And now Libby has gone missing and the girls are fighting. And what the fuck is Atlas up to? And there's just a lot of ruminating. There's a lot of scholarship. There's a lot of talking in circles. There's a lot of trying to solve a mystery, and it was so interesting to me. I think that if her plots were less interesting, the books would be very boring. And I know still some people find her writing really dense and boring because it's 5 people in a house fighting with each other constantly. It's always them talking to another person who's talking to the other person, who's just constant conversations, and then them trying to do like 4D chess and checkers in their head at the same time, and them trying to figure out what's going on. It's a lot of Rubik's Cube little things. And if that's not your vibe, if that kind of dense writing that talks itself in circles is not your vibe, again, Olivia Blake is not for you. She is for me. I'm that girly. And if you read the Atlas 6 and you went, oh my God, the girlies are fighting for 500 pages and they're all gay for each other. This book is a polyamorous pansexual's dream because the girlies may be fighting and those hands may be rated E for everyone, but they're also fucking. So their bodies are also rated E for everyone. And I love that for them, actually. The next book that I read in July was Between Despair and Hope by Jess Weisskopf. This is the sequel to Between Wrath and Mercy, that Kindle Unlimited pick in March that made me cry a lot because it was hitting me in a very deeply personal place that I'm still unwilling to deconstruct at this time. This is a sequel, and I rated the first book 5 stars. This was 4.25. It was obviously not as good as the first one in my opinion, but that may have just been because the first book hit me at a really personal time in a really personal place. So that might be my emotions talking. In Between Despair and Hope, we pick up where the last book left off, where Rainier has been kidnapped by Declan and we need to go rescue him. This book is over 800 fucking pages long, so it is not only slightly overwritten, but it's also filled with a lot of things that I would have preferred didn't get elaborated. There is a good first chunk of the book that is dedicated to Rainier being in captivity, and things happen to him in captivity that I wish didn't, but it didn't play into that trope where someone gets kidnapped in the final chapter of book 1 and they're rescued by chapter 2 of book 2. That certainly didn't happen, and I know that like you end book 1 and you go, oh no, they're kidnapped, and you want them to be safe and sound as soon as possible. It was both refreshing on one side to have a character who was in captivity for a long time that had to then spend the rest of the book deconstructing and dealing with the trauma that they were put through, because it was deep trauma. It wasn't just Rainier was in captivity for like 10 to 15% of the book and then he was fine afterwards. He spends most of the book in emotional and mental turmoil that is painful to watch him experience. The PTSD that he experiences and how it puts his relationship with Emmeline on the rocks and how it affects them and how it affects him as king. At the same time, I need to issue a trigger warning for the parts he was in captivity for, because if you're not prepared to read something like that or ingest a story like that that gets real, then maybe pick this book up at a different time. But if you're not in the mindset to read a story that is not just like a fantasy romance, but that also deals with really in-depth themes of trauma and PTSD and the consequence of war crimes. But multiple characters are affected by trauma and PTSD in this story. If you're not willing to experience that, pick this up at a later time. I'll let you know the title is very accurate. It's not just just a title to go by. No, the whole time you're in this book, it is between despair and hope, because there's a lot of despair and very little hope. And I think that this was very well done. I think that this was done with a lot of grace. I think that it was handled well, because not every person can write characters with PTSD. I know that Sarah J. Maas gets a lot of flack, especially for how she wrote Feyre in later books in ACOTAR. like an attempt was made. This, much different ball game. There's a lot of politicking in this book as well. So there's a lot of discussions about what they're going to do about an enemy and what they're going to do in the future and what with this country and with this country. There's a bit of theological conspiracy and religious extremism. So it touches on a lot of subjects, but then the story also goes very in depth with Rainier and Emmeline's relationship. They are now married, they are bonded, they are acknowledged as a twin flame bond, which is different than a normal bond. It's a deeper bond than just a normal magical bond. But the trauma that the both of them go through in different ways affects their relationship at such a deep level that they genuinely struggle to get back to where they were at the end of the first book, where they were realizing that they were twin flames and that they loved each other and that they got married, and they spend a lot of the book getting back to that. There's also a lot of touching moments with Alora, who at the end of the first book was revealed to be Rainier's daughter, and Alora and Rainier start to develop their father-daughter relationship. It's very cute, it's very witty, it has its moments where you kind of like giggle to yourself a little bit, like giggle kicking your feet a little bit. This is the hope in the story that these two who were separated through time, not knowing that they were father and daughter, with Emmeline not even knowing that they were father and daughter, that the two of them developing a relationship later in life and how they navigate that. It's very endearing, it's very heartwarming, and it made me giggle and kick my feet a little bit. I would say that my main criticism with this story is that I'm looking at the story graph right now. The book is 816 pages. That's a long fucking book. I felt like there was two completely different stories going on in one book that could have been separated into its own story, but I understand that the book is the entire narrative cast, but you had one side where you had Emmeline and Rainier and Alora and all of their trauma and figuring out their relationship, and then on the other side you had DeWalt and Lavinia. DeWalt is like finding his own identity outside of his bond with Lavinia, and then Lavinia realizing she can no longer use DeWalt as a crutch, and they have their own little subplots going on outside of just their relationship subplot. But I felt like there was two different books going on in one. Like, this could have been two 400-page books almost, or a 500-page book and a 300-page book, or a novella or something. I have to wonder if maybe it was slightly overwritten, or again, if it could have been separated into two books, because it's not that there was a lot of like narrative whiplash, or that there was too much going on that you got confused. Like, there were very much two distinct stories that involved their own characters with a little bit of overlap in the middle. This book was a lot. And the third book in the series actually came out today. As I'm recording this, it is August 8th, and Between Fear and Favor came out today. So I didn't really intend to read it so soon after I finished the last one, but time is silly and I am the silliest little goose, so I will push it up my TBR and read it sooner rather than later. I mean, it's on Kindle Unlimited, so why not? But I am getting a lot of library holds in right now, and I'm trying to get through those as well, because I put in a lot of holds after I had like all the ones that I had read through after Babel and Fourth Wing. I kind of came to a standstill where I hadn't put in any holds, so I went ahead and just made a bunch of them, like 20 to 25 holds, and now they're all coming up. The next book I read was Belladonna by Adeline Grace. If you follow me on Twitter, I did clown on one particular scene in this book because I thought it was so goofy and out of the blue. But other than that, this was a 5-star read. I was actually kind of shook. I've been really loving this dark, mysterious, like Victorian fantasy that I've been reading a lot lately. Like Belladonna is a really good example. Sorcery of Thorns is another good example. Belladonna is about a girl who literally cannot die. She's in a love-hate relationship with Death himself, and she routinely munches on Belladonna to induce hallucinations, just so she can talk to Death for a little while and they can have a little chit chat. And he's not usually very happy to be there, but he usually just stands there crossing his arms going, you can't die, so I don't know why you did this to yourself. Through that little experimentation and back and forth, she discovers she has kind of powers. She's got cool little sleigh girl powers, literally sleigh girl powers, because she can kill people with just a single touch. She's kind of getting tossed around Guardians like a series of unfortunate events style, where she's not quite old enough in her own right to inherit her family fortune. So she keeps getting tossed around to different relatives who are like loosely related to her, but then they all end up dying mysteriously, like around her. And she's not doing it. They just, end up having accidents, falling off a horse, slipping on the ice, having a cold, like dying of old age. She has really, really bad luck, basically. And the next place that she ends up is basically the family of her cousin, I believe, and her cousin just died. So she walks into this house that is only related to her through marriage, and her cousin has just died, and they don't know what happened to her, but her daughter is sick with the same illness, and Cigna has to figure out what's going on because she wants to stop being tossed around different homes. So she enlists the help of Death to solve a little murder mystery, and it involves contacting ghosts and communicating with them. It involves uncovering forbidden love, torrid love affairs, curses, like just communicating with ghosts is just cool enough. And then in between all this, Death is kind of a love interest, and that was what I was clowning on, was because at the point where Death was becoming a love interest, I was like focusing too much on the logistics of it because they didn't know if Death was ever a person. It's like, okay, she's developing romantic and sexual feelings for a figure, not a person. He isn't sure if he was ever a person. He's not a thing. He's a being? A being. Is he made of actual, like, specks of carbon like the rest of us, or is he made of pixie dust? How is she having sexual feelings for someone made out of pixie dust? I was just focusing too hard on the logistics of it. I just needed to reel it back a little bit and let the story be silly. And just, oh my god, yeah, she's in love with the death itself. Slay. I love that for her. I just had a grand old time, and like the mystery was really compelling because there was a lot of twists, a lot of turns, a lot of things I didn't even see coming. Even if I like sort of saw what was coming, there were more things after that. It's kind of like that clip of George R. R. Martin that you see that, if you write a story planting all these clues that the butler did it, you can't at the end turn it around and say, oh no, it was actually the chambermaid, because then the rest of the story doesn't make any sense. So it's really good writing for a author to plant these little seeds inside of a story to tell you how a story is supposed to go, and laying out all these clues about who was the murderer. But when you go one step further and you don't just have the butler go, yeah, I did it. Yeah, I did it. I had my reasons. It's so much more interesting when the butler tells you the reasons. And then when the reasons have reasons. And I was like, oh, okay, this is actually a much deeper thing than I thought it was. So honestly, props. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to read the next one. And then unfortunately, we land on the book that should have been my 4th DNF of the month, but I stayed so strong with the weakest disposition to get through this book because it was so bad. I may not be an author, so my words don't mean shit, but this didn't make any fucking sense. The London Seance Society is the second novel written by Sarah Penner, who previously wrote The Lost Apothecary, which I rated 5 stars because I really liked it, despite reading some Goodread reviews that were a little disheartening, but I rated it 5 stars and I liked it a lot. But The London Seance Society is not a sequel, but it kind of takes the same vibe as The Lost Apothecary and keeps it moving. Then it also doesn't have the same vibe because I was expecting a much different story than what we got. In this story, we meet Lena, who is a aspiring geologist of some sort. She likes to look at rocks and fossils. She's not quite a paleontologist, but she loves looking at fossils and rocks and wants to work for a museum. Lena's sister Evie, who was really into like seances and ghosts and the kind of like spiritualism of the Victorian era, was murdered on All Hallows Eve. In her memory, Lena abandons her blossoming career in geology and musology to kind of be taught how to be a medium because she doesn't feel right about her sister's death and she wants to know what happened. She goes to her sister's teacher, who's Vaudeline. Her name is French, so I can't pronounce her last name, but her first name is Vaudeline, and she is a renowned medium from France that was run out of London at some point for very mysterious reasons, and we have no idea why. But she was loosely affiliated with the London Seance Society, a gentleman's club that specializes in performing seances for usually grieving widows and families to kind of give them, their last wishes and tell their loved ones that they love them and such. What Vaudeline does is she holds seances to solve murders, which so interesting. So she goes to families who have loved ones who died under mysterious and or violent circumstances, and then she performs a seance to contact them and find out how they died. And she's very successful in doing this. It's pretty gauche and controversial. On the same night that Lena's sister Evie died, the CEO or president of the London Seance Society, the Gentlemen's Club, also died. The two of them both died on All Hallows Eve, murdered, potentially, mysterious circumstances. And now Lena and Vaudeline are trying to figure out what happened to the both of them. The story was told in two perspectives. You had Lena's perspective, which was in third person, and then you had a first person perspective from, I don't even remember his name at this time, but he was a member of the London Seance Society who becomes a very prominent figure in the book. He's a director of one of the departments of the London Seance Society, and he is involved with them because they are starting to uncover issues with the society, that people are performing fraud, that are using cheap parlor tricks to enamor people into believing things are happening when they're not, and kind of performing fake seances, basically. So they're trying to root out that, not just finding out who murdered the society president, but then also rooting out the evil that is going on in the society where people are performing disingenuous services. I'm not going to tell you anything because I will talk about it more in a in-depth video. This was just not what I expected. It was very, very bad. You found out who the whodunit was very early on. It wasn't a mystery at all. It was more like you were told who did it, and then by the end of the book, you had to find out why. And I didn't enjoy this. I didn't like this. There were moments that I liked what was going on. I liked that there was sapphic representation. The sapphic representation was bad, but it was still there. I understand that there is still a disparity in representation of queer relationships and queer love in fiction, but I think at some point we need to have a discussion about not all representation is good representation, because this was not great representation. Obviously, the relationship is between Lena and Vaudeline. Vaudeline encompasses the sexually liberated bisexual French woman stereotype. Then you also had Lena as a stereotype where her best friend that died several years ago, that was her best friend all her life, was also her first love. You had those two very common stereotypes between like the sexually repressed English woman and the sexually liberated French woman. So already I was off to a rough start with like, okay, I'm so glad that there's lesbians, but can we not make them stereotypes at the same time, or caricatures? And there were discussions and themes about overcoming obstacles internally and externally as someone with a queer identity, and I did appreciate that, which is why the book is rated 2 stars and not 1. I thought if you took the bare bones of this story, like teacher-student lesbian couple solves murders by contacting ghosts, could have been so much more interesting than it was. Can't believe that that went from my most anticipated read to my most disappointed read. That's not a pipeline that I anticipated, and I'm sorry that it had to be this way. My goals this month in August are to read 8 books. I have them all written down, but holds are coming in from the library that aren't on the list of books that I curated for myself. I want to read 7 to 10 books every month. Of course, I only read 6 in July, but I DNF'd 3. So go me. We're really succeeding now that I've made these new goals for myself. And I will talk about the books that I DNF'd at a later time. Of course, that video will just be a half hour to 45 minutes of me complaining, but I love watching other people complain. I mean, I'm one of Crimson Rogue's biggest fans, to be completely honest with you. Watching his videos is like a cinematic event. That is my Super Bowl. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you'd like to find me anywhere else, you can find me on Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. I am planning to make a streaming comeback here in the next couple of weeks, actually for realsies, as I transition from being a on-camera streamer to a VTuber or a PNG tuber. I am messing around with getting some things designed because I would like to stream again, but I don't want to be on camera as much as I used to be. So I am excited to see what that journey holds for me, and I look forward to seeing the rest of you on Twitch and or YouTube in the streaming community once more here in a couple of weeks. Remember to drink water and be nice to each other and exude kindness and empathy with everything that you do, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!